Hey everyone, in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down one of Manly Hall's lectures. It's titled Initiation of the Pyramid. It might actually have multiple titles. This is actually a lecture I had found on YouTube. There may be a different official title for it, but the one I'm going to use today is Initiation of the Pyramid. And this lecture is going to coincide with the article I just published and the episode I just published on the podcast, which have to do with looking at the role that the mystery schools played within the priesthood and temple complexes of the ancient world, and also what it advocated and how it functioned as an organization. And we also considered the topic of what happened to these mystery schools. So that's the themes I explored in the article and in the previous episode. In this episode, we're going to be further unpacking that story by looking at this lecture of Manly Hall. So Manly Hall is going to begin by focusing in on this period of transition between the pagan era of institutions and the New World Order, indicated by the rise of the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, as this geopolitical force in the world. And something that we're going to be going into more detail in this episode that I went into less detail in the article just for sake of brevity is the kind of detail, more of the details about how this took place. So Manly Hall is going to start off by focusing in on Alexandria as this hub. So it was this critical hub where the wisdom traditions, the philosophical traditions of the mystery schools and the ancient temple system, where they mingled together. And out of this Alexandrian place, we have these wisdom teachings repackaged in new forms. So this is where we see Kabbalism emerge. This is where we see Hermeticism emerge. This is where we see Neoplatonism emerge and Gnosticism. So there is a very important part in this transition period that Alexandria played. This is what Manly Hall is going to be focusing on and discussing here, is the greatness of Alexandria and how the schools that came out of Alexandria were the product of these mysterious mystery school institutions that existed in various major cultural centers throughout Eurasia and North Africa, but which converged in order to repackage their teachings in new forms in this Alexandria place. So it was a mingling of many different doctrines, and an important part was played here during this transition period. So the underlying idea here is that at the very beginning of the Piscean Age, of the birth of Christianity, there was basically two groups that were trying to drive this religious movement in different directions. And one was the much smaller group of mystic sects who are associated with the mystery school traditions and upholding the high standards that they set in terms of what they required from their disciples or people who pledged allegiance to it. And then there was the doctrine of the popular church, which is not demanding on a personal level, but instead just requires the allegiance of the population. And so it was a much easier route to be saved, one versus the other. And I think that dynamic explains why the Orthodox version of Christianity became popular. It became the movement of the masses partly because of its dropping of the strict requirements of the mystery school system at this critical point in this transition period. And so the church takes over as this new global force, and it has to persecute all groups who are teaching something that is in contention with what they're claiming for themselves, this unique position that they're claiming for themselves, which allows them to create this global geopolitical force, this great unifying movement between civilizations that the Christian church became during their effort to basically homogenize the religions of the world under the Christian dispensation. So it became so religion and the church became, on one hand, detached from the state, and on another hand, became this major globalizing force in the world. And as a consequence of this, the ancient mystery school traditions that were represented in Alexandria during this early age, these groups who had true, authentic connection to the esoteric doctrines, they went underground in order to preserve the highest of the secrets, but in a way that the corruptions of this larger Catholic enterprise that was taking shape all over the world, all over Europe, that it would become protected from those rivals. And so that is the basic geopolitical landscape that sets off some of the dynamics that took place in Europe, in the relationship of Europe to Asia during the Dark Ages, and then going into the Renaissance and beyond. There's this motion of secret societies. Anyway, that was all kind of getting into an introduction to what Manly Hall is going to be talking about in this upcoming clip. He's going to be going into the history of Alexandria. So we're going to be launching things from here. And then after this, we're going to be kind of going into more specifically the mystery schools and the process of initiation. And also in this episode, he talks a lot about the Great Pyramid, which I'm going to kind of scroll over some of that footage because it's not the main focus of this episode. But the Great Pyramid of Giza is like one of the most fascinating things you can possibly study, and is, I think, proof of concept that there is this tradition of the mystery schools and the sacred knowledge that they possessed, and how they were responsible for the high feats of the ancient world. Because the Great Pyramid is truly a marvel on Earth. It's one of the most amazing and like breathtaking things that you can study in terms of its geometry and mathematics and geospatial positioning, but also what it represents symbolically. So I talk about that a little bit in the article, but I just want to note that Manly Hall will be talking some about the pyramid, but I'm going to be editing out some further of the material, so you can watch the whole original episode if you want to catch all of what he's saying about the Great Pyramid. So anyway, let's kick things off here with Manly Hall.
For some time, I've been contemplating the peculiar situation that existed in Egypt at the beginning of the Christian era. The city of Alexandria had become the great center of learning for the entire Western civilization. Alexandria had been founded in the time of Alexander the Great and was under the domination of the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. And this domination continued until the death of Cleopatra, and then Rome took over. But the tremendous interest in Alexandria developed around the almost incomparable amassment of knowledge that was assembled there. Practically every field of human research was developed, unfolded, and progressed within the Alexandrian atmosphere. Alexandria was a city on the caravan routes. East and West mingled there. The Oriental doctrines and the Greco-Latin doctrines mingled together in a very strange confusion. After the rise of Christianity, both the Christian faith and Judaism had strong holdings in Alexandria. And it is safe to say that the composite there was made up of at least a dozen or 20 of the great religions and philosophies of antiquity. It was an amazing and unique center of learning. There was one other important factor in the Alexandrian complex, and that was the great structure of libraries. The Alexandrian libraries were the most famous in antiquity and probably the largest ever assembled in ancient times. The Serapeum and the Brachium contained together over 1 million manuscripts, tablets, and papyri containing the wisdom of the ancient world. When these libraries were ruthlessly destroyed, humanity was deprived of perhaps more knowledge than we will ever realize or appreciate. The destruction of these libraries also closed off our knowledge of the source of Alexandrian wisdom. It is quite possible that many ideas, beliefs, and doctrines which we now believe were invented in Alexandria were actually derived from the great research libraries, and therefore had a solid substance, but the substance has vanished and only legends and fables remain. These mysterious people that occupied this great Egyptian area were almost universally learned. Everywhere we find them, in herbalism, in medicine, in philosophy, in art, literature, poetry. We know, for example, that the entire structure of Hermetic thinking and the story of Hermes Trismegistus arose in Alexandria. And we also know that the Alexandrians must have had a considerable sense of prophecy. It was there also that the Sibylline books developed that prophesied the future of the world. It was Ptolemy of Alexandria that gave the world astronomy and very largely contributed to the rise of astrology. There were zoological gardens, there were ponds for fish, there were reserves to protect animals. There was just about anything and everything you can think of.
Manly Hall is going to move from talking about the situation in Alexandria. He's going to talk about the pyramids, because he was saying that not far from Alexandria was the complex at Giza with the Great Pyramid. And he notes that these pyramid shapes are found all over the earth. So essentially what the pyramids represent is the existence of the mystery school systems in all these different cultures. There were great accomplishments, mysterious accomplishments that the ancient world produced and achieved, and the only explanation is that the knowledge was held within the priesthoods. And so these great pyramid structures indicate, and also are like a calling card of the mystery school system. Here, the way he talks about the pyramids, he's really comparing them with the situation in Alexandria and showing that the Alexandrian golden age emerged out of a motion of the knowledge held within the mystery schools into Alexandria during this transformation period going into the Piscean Age.
And not far outside of the boundaries of Alexandria stood the great group of pyramids, which have remained to this time the wonders of the world. Very little is actually known about the pyramids. Contemporary records are very scanty. They are mentioned by Herodotus in the 5th century BC. But for the most part, no one has had an interest deep enough to attempt to investigate the circumstances surrounding the building of these great monuments. To this day, we really do not know why they were built, when they were built, and how it has happened that they have continued to intrigue human thinking for so long a period of time. Perhaps the most simple beginning for the search for pyramids is to realize that the pyramid builders represent a period in the development of human society. Pyramids were built in many different places. Probably one of the most interesting groups right here on the Western Hemisphere, the pyramid towers and temples of the Aztec and Maya culture. A few years ago, enormous pyramids were discovered in central China. And we know that the ziggurats of Babylon and Chaldea were all part of this great pyramid building scheme of things. The shape of the pyramid changed considerably in the course of time. In the beginning, it was a mound, and the very earliest examples still had the mound form, and these are still found in the great monuments in Java, the Borobudur, which is probably one of the most powerful and fascinating religious monuments now surviving, the Shwe Dagon in Rangoon, the great cities of the Khmer culture of Indochina, Cambodia, and Laos. All of these have pyramid structures peculiar to them. Pyramids appear, foreshortened or otherwise, also in graphic art. and among the mandalas of Tibet, Mongolia, Bhutan, Korea, China, and Japan, the pyramid design occurs frequently and represents a basis of a great meditation picture. This has led some scholars to assume that the pyramids were meditation symbols, that they were created for the purpose of reminding the individual that there was a mysterious reality underlying all the temporal and changeable patterns of mankind. In the Asclepian dialogue, Hermes describes the fact that in a sense these buildings were memorials to the divine power. They bore witness to those times and those thoughts when the gods walked with men. They became part of a traditional heritage, and if we study Neoplatonism, we will come to the conclusion that the gods who walked with men were actually the gods in men, that it was a divine level of insight which resulted in the great architectural feedback which we know as the pyramids. Actually, the circumstances around them challenge our imagination. We know that whoever built the Great Pyramid of Giza was well acquainted with astronomy, that he had a very complete knowledge of the solar system and all of the wonders of the cosmic plan as revealed through the bodies and objects moving in the heavens. He knew the distances between the Earth and the other planets of the solar system. He knew the precession of the equinoxes. He realized the importance of the star groups. He already knew the decans and dodecanates of the zodiac. These things just do not fit into the general concept that we have of the state of the world when the pyramid was presumed to have been built. The only possible answer is, on this level, that at the time the pyramid builders labored, they had a knowledge among themselves that had not been distributed to the people. Even the rulers did not possess this knowledge. And that there was a cult or sect of architects and artificers, the builders of monuments, who knew the proportions and mathematics and had deeply imbibed from the wisdom of Pythagoras and Euclid. But even this isn't a complete explanation, for it is almost impossible to determine how this tremendous job was done. The idea that we have is far too trite. They thought that perhaps they were simply built as a result of slave labor in Egypt will not hold water. It is simply not sufficient. The amount of work that is involved in those monuments simply transcends imagination. Also, they require a skill and a group of instrumental aids which we do not believe that antiquity possessed. And it is only natural when we come into the presence of something that transcends our own abilities that we begin to wonder whether some strange esoteric means was involved, as in the case of the statues on Easter Island and many other such unsolved mysteries of antiquity.
All right, in this next clip, he's going to do a description and like a detailed analysis of who is in the mystery schools, what makes this high element of the priesthood different from your normal person. And he's going to specifically mention the Egyptian pyramid builders, the quality of person that would have been involved in that project. But really, by extrapolation, he's talking about the type of individual who would have been an initiate of the mystery schools, not just in Egypt, but in any of the great civilizations. Essentially, he's going to describe these initiates as awakened individuals, and he's going to talk about like what qualities and characteristics they would have demonstrated.
We know that the Egyptians and other nations of that period were esotericists. We know that they had a knowledge of natural law far ahead of their time, and they had a responsibility for the use of natural law far ahead of our time. These people had a deep appreciation for the immensity and integrity of the universal plan. They had already discovered thousands of years ago that you cannot break natural law without suffering. They had never developed that strange type of egotism which impels us often to assume that God is depending upon us to take care of his purposes and plans. They did not think this. They realized or believed that they were the servants of an infinite reality.
So basically here he's making the case that the initiates had a quality awakened in their consciousness that the universal would actively move into the individual. And so they would be peoples whose mind state and worldview and orientation was one in which universal concerns were their priority rather than individual concerns. So that's the main difference between the individual and the initiate is aware that there is a universal law, and they discipline themselves to participate with that law so as to number one, purify themselves, number two, awaken powers and potentials latent within themselves, and number three, to be servants of the universal law, or the universal plan, and the consciousness behind that plan, the law of that whole system that the creating power has devised for his creation. So mankind is this specific kingdom in nature that has the capacity to disobey. And through this disobedience, we suffer karma and consequence. So we move outside of the law. Our disobedience is to move outside of the law. And so the way of the mystery schools was to re-center the candidate back into law. And that's how you accomplish the awakenings that Manly Hall is talking about these people possess. So they were universally oriented. So it is that simple. It's about the law and understanding how to root yourself in the law of your own existence. In this next clip, Manly Hall is going to unpack a little bit about the differences between ancient civilization and modern civilization, and how ancient civilization was more introverted, more gathering knowledge from one's intuition. And in this current age, it's more about materialism and about engaging with the outer world or externalizing one's consciousness. So ancient world, more internal consciousness, and in the current world, more of an external oriented consciousness. And in the ancient world, they're saying that the masters of this more inward oriented form of civilization was the masters of that world were masters of the inner life. And that's who the great gurus and adepts and hierophants and initiates were. These were people who had mastered the science and art of meditation, essentially. This tradition of mastery of the internal life comes down from the highest of antiquity, and essentially comes down from a previous cycle of human existence, which is the Atlantean age. So it descended to us from basically like prehistory, and its fundamental orientation is one of unlocking the inner life. That's what the purpose of it is. And we've entered a phase in human civilization where everything is about consciousness has externalized itself to focus on its engagement with the outer world. So society as a whole has become this extroverted force, whereas in ancient society it was more introverted. What Manly Hall is going to make the case of is that the mystery schools, the ones who are the masters of the inner life, are actually always the true power base in the world.
One thing that comes to mind then in connection with this whole situation is that we may have to revise our understanding of what antiquity was like. Perhaps we cannot assume that we have gradually arisen from a completely barbarian state, and that in a few thousand years behind our present culture there was nothing but a colossal ignorance. This concept will not hold. Somewhere along the way there were tremendous minds, a great body of knowledge that was capable of planning and executing unbelievable works of skill, beauty, and wisdom. The Egyptians themselves were of the opinion that at a remote time the gods had been with men, that deities and divine powers walked the earth. Now, this again may be regarded as symbolical. Perhaps what they were trying to tell us is that in a remote time long ago, the human being was naturally mystical, naturally had the power of extrasensory perception, naturally could communicate or understand, estimate, or react to the divine principles upon which the universe was based. That the gods walking with men merely meant that the God power in man was not obscured as it is now. That gradually over a course of time, the material world has taken over. The ancient peoples had a very simple physical existence comparatively. There was no problem of population, no intensive competition in trade, and wars were comparatively limited to a few swashbuckling militarists. The people in general lived a very quiet and a natural life, completely dependent upon their insights into universal laws. And yet these people, intuitively and internally, had a tremendous depth of insight. This depth of insight has been lost as the result of the individual being subjected to continual external conditioning. He is taught from childhood not to think for himself, not to search within himself for the answers to his problems, but to read them out of books and have them conferred upon him by physical educational processes. As a result of that, he has lost the power of direct contact with realities. His new philosophy, if you could call it such, is built entirely upon the opinions of his contemporaries and the interpretations by these contemporaries of earlier documents and beliefs. If we assume that the individual was a source of almost complete knowledge, that he had the skills and the abilities to intuit nearly everything necessary to his own survival, it is then quite probable that we are gradually going to learn that the leaders of this intuitive procedure were parts of a great sacerdotal group. You might be willing to call them the mysterious sages, the wise men of ancient times, the first ones of the earth who knew, and the giants of mind and thought who were upon the earth in those days. In any event, however, there was undoubtedly a tradition that descended into Egypt from a still earlier source, a tradition based upon an internal development of spiritual resources, a development which went back perhaps to India or to one of the ancient civilizations that have now vanished away. But by 4,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 BC, there was a great knowledge in the hands or in the keeping of a few persons. And these few persons more or less set up the system of mysteries which operated in Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire.
Now, this next clip, Manly Hall is going to talk about one of the most important aspects of the type of instruction that you're given in the mystery school system. And remember, we're talking about an experiential type of knowledge that is emphasized here. We're talking about growing and developing one's consciousness in order to awaken the spiritual consciousness that underlies all existence. So it's attuning the individual consciousness with the universal consciousness, which is a spiritual consciousness. So that's what the mystery schools are about. And he's going to make the point that one of the important phases that you go through in the mystery school teachings, or one of the degrees you must pass, is you have to go through the experience of death and rebirth, which means that you undergo an experience of ego death, which was stimulated by the priesthood through the advanced knowledge of the human design pattern. They can manipulate that pattern in certain ways so as to cause the experience of death within the individual. And so they consciously experience what it's like to die, but then they're brought back into the body so as to continue forth with life with having that had the experience and the memory of what transpired after death. So anyway, yeah, Manly Hall here is going to be talking about this process in initiation of undergoing the spiritual rebirth. That's why the initiates were called people who had been born again. This is what that means. This is the living resurrection, where you die and then come back into the body with the knowledge of what you experienced after death.
The initiate system, which was the prevailing system in Egypt at that time, was based upon one tremendous point, a point which we have lost, a point which we have never really attempted to restore, but about which we have given considerable thought and consideration. The purposes of the mysteries, according to such initiates as Plotinus, Proclus, Iamblichus, Ammonius Saccas, and others, was very simple, that the individual should learn factually, truly, beyond question, beyond doubt, through personal experience, that death is an illusion. That immortality is the summit of man's problem. That the ancients not only believed in it, but kept this belief in secret, but developed a science by means of which they could communicate the fact and example and circumstance of death directly to another person. In other words, the initiates of the mysteries, according to the old concepts, were persons who had lived, died, and been born again in this world. In order to accomplish this, there was an elaborate ritual system, because upon the concept of immortality was built the entire problem of an enduring material culture in this world. If immortality was demonstrable, beyond question, not the result of communication, not because certain famous person had believed it, not because we wanted to believe it, or because it was written in sacred books, or anything of that nature, but because the individual who believed it had died, passed through the experience, and come back to life. This was the burden of the mystery system, was to prove conclusively that death was not the end of anything. Cicero marks this in his discussion of his relationships with life. Marcus Aurelius refers to it. But he refers to it, as they all did, as something known, not something believed. Something that could not be denied because it had been an actual experience in the life of the believer. Thus, in the mystery system, in the Egyptian, which we are interested in the moment particularly, the Book of the Dead, which is a misnomer, part of the same type of misnomer that afflicts us in many other ways. The Book of the Dead, so called, the Egyptian name for which was not the Book of the Dead, but the Book of the Coming Forth by Day and of the Opening of the Mouth. This was the famous name in ancient times for such great papyri as are in the museum of the British Museum, of the Papyrus of Ani and the Papyrus of Hanufa. These were great examples of the dead coming back to life through the mysteries. Therefore, the ancient philosophy of life was built upon an eternality of life. It was built upon the fact that the individual was for everlastingness, that he would go on. There was no end to him. There was no one converting people to this. There was no one preaching it or teaching it. In the mysteries, the candidate went through it himself as an actual fact. And this was the burden of the mystery. That the individual who knew, not because he could believe or have faith, but because through the rites, ceremonies, and esoteric practices of the temple, he lived through it and came through alive, and came out of darkness into light, knew as a certainty beyond question that there was no death. Now, we don't realize, perhaps, how important this point would be in the modeling of civilization. We do not realize how oppressive the concept of death is. The main point was to establish the reality of survival and its associate belief, the consciousness or concept of rebirth. Rebirth was simply immortality, spaced out. It was a part of the everlasting, ever-livingness of everything that exists. The ancients, therefore, had very little fear of death, and something of the form of a mystical experience of this probably influenced the Christian martyrs in the Circus Maximus in Rome, when they died for their faith. There was something about it all that transformed a life of fear into a life of certainty. It also removed the dynamic importance of material existence and represented it in this world as merely the antechamber to eternity itself. And I believe it was Porphyry, may have been Plotinus, who said on one occasion that in human life, birth physically was the human being coming out of the womb into a body, and that this body itself became the womb of the second birth. For the individual retaining enlightenment transcended the limitation of body, and those who did not achieve this were born out of body into an unembodied state at the end of life. So that this pattern was regarded as part of the mystery ritual. Another interesting example of this particular type of thought is to be found in Judo in Japan. Judo and many other of the self-defensive arts of the Orient are concerned with a peculiar kind of courage, a courage which must be completely free from anxiety and fear. If the fear exists, the individual is weakened by the rise of a terror within himself, and therefore usually comes to disaster in his own day and in his own way. So in Judo, before the artist achieves the highest grades of the art, he must be killed. His teacher kills him. His teacher performs certain structural pressures upon the body that stop the heart. And the heart is allowed to be stopped for a certain number of seconds, or early 1 or 2 minutes. Then the master resuscitates the disciple by pressure upon other parts of the body, according to the higher grades of Judo. And in this case, the person who has been killed lives again, remembers and knows what happened to him, and realizes that his fear of death was ungrounded, that the fear of transition, which might make him a coward in this world, was simply an illusion of his own mind, that actually transition was just as normal, natural, and reasonable as any other aspect of life, and that there was no interruption. The individual never ceased to be an immortal being, whether in body or out of it. Now, the Egyptians apparently built on this very, very strongly. So did the Hindus. They felt or realized the tremendous significance of this realization that there was no termination, that there was no end, that the labors of a life were never lost, and that the achievements of a life were forever necessary, that the individual who had an idea that his virtues might go to oblivion with him was wrong, and the one who believed that his vices would go to oblivion with him, he also is wrong. There is an interruption of place, but not of state. There is an interruption in the sequence of relationships between the individual and the material body, but no interruption in the continuity of the life within that body.
Now, in this upcoming section, we're going to be moving on to a talk about what the master blueprint is here in terms of the mystery schools and what their plan is for human civilization, the long-term evolutionary arc of human civilization. And that is to gradually initiate the mass of humanity as a whole. And part of the mass initiation of humanity is the motion of the mysteries into a new global form, a globally interconnected civilization with a global expression of the mystery schools. And so he's really going to make the case that the mystery schools are managing this long-term motion. They're managing this long-term transition and developmental phase that humanity as a collective soul is going through. So that's really what he's going to be talking about in this upcoming clip, is these long-term motions of the mystery school system and what their ultimate aims are for the development of humanity towards a certain end state. Ultimately, all of humanity is to be initiated, so as a collective group we can have the whole race be elevated to become one collective expression of the divine will.
Thus, materialism, which has become more or less prevalent in our time, can be held responsible for a very large amount of the unfortunate pressure that bothers us today. Materialism sustains crime, helps to build a constant fear, makes the individual highly materialistic because he knows no other outlet, and little by little the world comes to be afraid of life, afraid of the existence of which, in which it passes its days here in the world. Asclepius and Hermes in the dialogue pointed out that the time would come when Egypt, which of course was a symbol of the whole world, would forget its gods, that it would deteriorate, that it would depart from heaven, that it would build false images, false goals, and false purposes to justify its own errors, that it would go into a state of conflict with all other things, that it would waste the values of the earth. He points out definitely that the earth would be impoverished, the soil would be impoverished, that the humanity living would have no conception of its responsibilities, but would live for pleasure and profit alone. And as this happened, gradually the planet would become a desert. That everything that was useful would no longer be able to function or manifest itself. But that in spite of this, that something inside of the human being could not die. This eternal life that was recognized in the great mystery system went on. And also in the course of time, the life within the individual would revolt against the misconduct of his mind, emotions, and body. And when the great tragedy revealed itself to be the result of human selfishness, cupidity, and ignorance, the humanity would then go back to the gods, go back to the divine principle within himself, and create a new world emerging out of his own repentance, out of his own realization of his mistake, out of his own fear, perhaps, of the final destruction of himself and everything that exists. But nothing will be destroyed. It is all part of the illusion. It is an illusion which continues until the human being makes peace with universal law. When the human being accepts the governorship of the great values of life, he is then no longer subject to the infirmities of the flesh.
Next clip, Manly Hall is going to unpack a little bit more about what the underlying worldview is of the priesthood of the mystery schools, of the adepts and initiates. And remember, these groups correspond to people who have had an awakening of the universal within themselves as individuals. So that's the key quality, this universalizing of the individual. And so that's the quality that the initiates and the adepts have, this universal quality. What the mystery schools really were is they are this agent of evolution, the evolution of the soul, and to return the soul from an individual orientation back into a collective and a universal orientation. and its work is done one candidate at a time. So each person is responsible ultimately for their own evolution. That's the unique factor in human existence. So anyway, he's going to be talking a little bit about the symbolism of the pyramid and the symbolism of the cube and the dome, and how all of these things fit together as one great symbol of these larger principles that esoteric philosophy is really rooting its entire analysis on. This way of looking at the relationship between the individual and the universal, and the individual human being, with the idea that there's a collective world soul that contains all of our lives within it, and that there's the universe is the product of one life moving into a creative phase, and how existence is really the ideation of this universal consciousness, and so the reality is in the universal side and not in the individual side. The individual side is of life, which is for us normal. This is actually just a phase in the growth and evolution of this one larger life. These are the values and ideas that would have been maintained and taught within the mystery school system and are the basis of the mystery school system, and that we can't really understand the mystery school system without understanding these core principles.
All of these together represent the survival of a language that had to do with the human realization of his own nature. The pyramid stood upon the earth. It represented a flame ascending. It was a radiant structure that had been built in ancient times, but it was always pointing upward. It was always impelling the individual to follow an ascending line and look up to the stars. The ancient astronomy divided existence into three levels, the lowest being the planes of elements, the second level being the planes of planets, and the third and higher level, the plane of the zodiac or the fixed stars. The universe had three great steps ascending, and the life of man consisted first of a descent, as in the story of the death of Tammuz in Babylonia, and finally out of the grave of materiality, a resurrection, a regeneration, and ascent up a ladder, Jacob's ladder, or the ladder of Muhammad, to ascend, as in the vision of St. John on Patmos, to the heavenly world that lay above the zodiac. This concept was a sort of skeleton upon which all of the philosophies of ancient times were built.
Within this context, he's going to be talking about the initiate. As you go through the mystery schools and you go through the degrees of initiation of the mystery schools, the unity factor, the spiritual factor wakens within you or blossoms out within you. So the consciousness of the whole becomes awakened within the self-consciousness of the individual part. That's what it's about. It's about this universalizing force. And so he's going to make that point, and he's going to be discussing really like the heart of the mystery schools, in terms of what their approach was, what purpose of the program was, what the point of it was. It is this universalizing force. It's this institution that serves as a vehicle within which the consciousness of the whole moves into and awakens itself within the consciousness of the part.
And like the prodigal son, whose father said, "My son was dead, but he is alive again." Humanity was the prodigal son. There were two ways of growing in this world. One was to grow slowly by cause and effect and by the labors of living. The world itself became a great temple in which initiation took place over a period of hundreds of lives. But to the ancients there was a wise man's way, and this wise man's way was to pass through by conscious intent and by purification the mystery of the whole cycle in one embodiment. Now one might say this would be the simple way, and I know a lot of metaphysicians at the present time who can hardly wait for that one embodiment that's going to do it all. But most of them have forgotten something, namely that this one embodiment means that everything accomplished in hundreds of lives must be accomplished in that one embodiment. It's not just a shortcut. It is a gathering up and intensifying the process of human regeneration. It means that the person must attain to a state by discipline, by dedication, and in accordance with universal law that qualifies him to receive this very important ritual. And after he has received the ritual, after he has had the experience, he is not released from responsibility, but brought into the presence of a greater responsibility. Having become, as Apuleius points out, a citizen of two worlds, the individual must act accordingly. He also learns from certain experiences along the way what he can't do and what he can do. He learns, for example, that if he is interested in primarily in his own security, he has already failed. It is not a case of where he is doing this to become nobler, more enlightened, more successful than other people. He is doing it for one purpose only, that he can be a better servant of the infinite. The ritual produces dedicated disciples of wisdom, not satisfied people who sit back and try to nurse their own intelligence. It is a case in which every step carries with it a heavy burden of duty, and that the final achievement requires the complete abnegation of personal self-interest, a complete overcoming of the problems of egoism and egotism. Otherwise, all is lost. Furthermore, there can be no backsliding, because the individual must reach a state of certainty before this enlightenment is given that makes it utterly and completely impossible to backslide. He cannot get it and then fail and turn from it. If he turns from it, it means he never had it. If he fails, he fails himself. He cannot fail the infinite. So that the rituals of the initiations of those times were very, very severe. There is an account that Thomas Taylor is said to have found in the records of the British Museum, although no proof is available of it. It is interesting, at least. Namely, that Plato was initiated in the Great Pyramid. And it was there that he received his own final enlightenment. Another interesting aspect of the pyramid problem, why should, for instance, would it be called the Tomb of Hermes? What and who was Hermes? Hermes was the Greek form of the deity Mercury, and the Egyptian form of Mercury and Hermes was Thoth, the god of the writing tablet. Hermes was a symbol of the universal mind, because it was said of him in his own day, whenever that was, because he is probably also a symbol invented by the Alexandrian esotericists. He is not known prior to the rise of Alexandria. What was that he was the author of 10,000 books, and some of the old stories tell us that he was the author of every book that was ever written in the world. Well, the implication is pretty obvious, namely that he has to represent the power of mind, which is the author of all things. Therefore, Hermes is universal mind. He is the universal mind that may have been symbolically buried in the Great Pyramid, which is supposed to have been his tomb. Not a Pharaoh, but the universal mind itself, which in turn might point out the idea of a universal symbolism, that the secret of the mind was built into the structure of the pyramid, and therefore the investigation of the pyramid could ultimately lead to the discovery of the nature of mind. In any event, however, Hermes, as the author of all the books in the world, became, in a sense at least, the symbol of the great esoteric schools. He became the scribe of the gods, the interpreter of heaven. He attended the psychostasia, or the weighing of the soul of the dead, in the great Egyptian mortuary papyri and paintings, and Budge and also Breasted of Chicago were perfectly aware that the Book of the Dead was a symbolic document, and that the symbolism of the death and resurrection of the soul in that book was based upon the rituals of the mysteries. This ritual was the story of the soul's journey into the afterlife, and was a very complicated story in the Egyptian mythology. But it all was condensed into a fraction of its original length in a ritual performed by the Egyptian priests. And this ritual was the ritual of coming forth by day. Those who die the ordinary death go forth by night, according to the Egyptians, and they wander in a kind of darkness, of uncertainty. They wander through a universe that is benign, wonderful, loving, but like an infant, they have no memory or no conscious thought of where they're going. So those of that type who just simply die as they have lived, asleep as to reality, who have never improved themselves by any conscious effort. These are the little ones. They're not evil. They're not doomed for perdition. Their mistakes will not prevent them from growing. But they are still unable to come forth by day, which means they cannot come forth consciously. They cannot come forth lighted by their own inner light. So they are the ones who must wait, or must go to the Amentet. The Amentet, or Elysian Fields, being the paradise of Egypt. The soul of the Egyptian who died went on into the other world and did what he did here. But after the initiation rites have been performed, the individual comes forth by day. He realizes his place in the plan. He realizes what is next for him. He realizes that going into this larger life is an opportunity to correct all failings of his own thinking, that he will come closer and closer to the eternal truths, which are the source of his ultimate union with deity. So by coming forth by day, he comes consciously into the afterlife, fully equipped to face its mysteries, fully equipped to adjust to its circumstances, and already able, at least dimly, to perceive the face of the great God that hides behind the veil. And in Egypt, I think the Egyptians believed that the Great Pyramid was the symbol of the state of consciousness, the state of the internal life of the individual, which in perfect mathematical order and harmony comes forth out of the body in the light and is led by the master of the secret house into the presence of the great gods, where he receives the Kroiksan Sata, the symbol of everlasting life. Everlasting life is not the fact that we live forever, for we do that whether we know it or not. But everlasting life is to know it, to realize it, to understand it, not to doubt or to fear. We have a life, as the Egyptians said, unto everlastingness. But only those who have retained a certain inward light know for certain that which others hope. And as one of the Roman philosophers said, wisdom brings knowledge to those who have hoped, and brings perfect understanding to those who have lived in a certain optimism, but not certain of that which is to come. But the mysteries may put the whole universe in order. They put the individual in order. They made everything as it was and as it should be. And the pyramid, according to the Egyptians, was a testimony set up under the directions of deities and their architects and artisans, so that all men might know that forever and ever the great light, the great good, and the flame of aspiration would burn in man. And if as long as it burns in man, it will burn in the world. So the wisdom of the ancients was to continually introduce and initiate the worthy into the real purpose of the plan, to help them to understand the great dignity of life, the great value and virtue of obedience to law, and that forever the pact between heaven and earth was sealed by the symbolism of the pyramid. This is what the Alexandrians worked out and thought about it, and I think it comes rather close to the facts of the matter.
Now, in this final clip, he's going to be talking about the core principles of philosophy. And philosophy is essentially the externalization of the mystery school teachings. This is something I haven't written about yet, but right before the fall of the pagan order of civilizations, a few hundred years before this happened, you had the golden age of philosophy. This is during the Axial Age. So right around 500 to 600 BC, you have all across the world these great philosophic teachers emerging out of the mystery system in order to create a new form or a new vehicle with which the mysteries could be opened up to society. The structure of these philosophical schools imitated the mystery school structure in terms of they were organized by a hierarchy of degrees, and only the highest students were taught directly by the teacher. And in this 500 BC period, you have the emergence of, in Greece, Pythagoras, who is actually the coiner of the term philosophy, and then later Plato. Both of them emerged directly out of the Greek mysteries and were actually also initiated into the mystery systems of Egypt and several other cultures. Both of them were. So they were products of the mystery school system, not only of Greece, but of the greater Eurasian continent. And this upcoming quote, Manly Hall, is going to be articulating some of the main points of philosophy, some of the main mystery school teachings that we can take away and apply to our understanding of daily life.
What most people do not realize is that ultimately the universe is very simple. It is man who complicates it. The universe is a simple process unfolding in its own way and has always been a direct unfoldment of principles. Man, however, has confused the issue completely. He has distorted and rearranged things for his own pleasures with no consideration for their essential natures or the principles for which they were intended. Everything that belongs to the material world is unfinished. Mortal existence, is an unfinished business. And it takes place in an unfinished world and challenges everything that lives here with the restrictions of an unfinished realization of truth. Everything is growing, but nothing has completed its growth. Everything is getting better, but nothing in the mortal world has finally achieved the state of being best. Everything we try to do, everything we try to work with, science particularly, should have a complete understanding of the mystery of the missing capstone, because science is worrying over it right at the moment, but on a different level of thought. Everything that science discovers leads somewhere, but when it just about gets to the point where it looks as though it might tell us a great truth, it fades away. All visible things, if you trace them upward to their highest conditions, disappear. All of the intellectual achievements of the individual or of the great system of learning, this ascends from one level of genius to another, but the supreme genius has never been reached. The supreme answer to the problem of life has never been reached. All that we have for these particular conclusions is our own inward realization. So the formula is rather simple. We can build everything on the outside up to a point, but to complete it we must call entirely upon the inside. It is our own inner life that must perfect every structure that is formed in the material world. The answer to everything lies in ourselves. We can read books up to a certain point. We can use laboratory experiments up to a certain point. But somewhere along the line, as the alchemists learned, and they studied from the Alexandrian savants, these alchemists learned that the final ingredient of the transmutation was man himself, the internal part of his own nature. His own soul had to transform base metals into gold. Each individual soul must perfect the structure of his life, otherwise it will never be perfected. So to account for this, nearly every monument of importance in the world either has the top part missing, or a bad scar in it, something imperfect, something that represents a flaw in the original purpose, because the completion of it must always depend upon the consciousness of the person beholding it. Otherwise, the secret cannot be perfected. Well, I guess that's all for today.